In this chapter, you discover how to use presets and actions. If you're familiar with using styles in some of the other Adobe Creative Suite applications, you'll be thrilled to see what you can do in Photoshop. So let's go. You don't typically start your car and drive off without knowing where you're going, and it's the same when you open up an image in Photoshop and you start doing your retouching or editing work. You really need to know where you're going, whether you're going to end up with this image on a print document, on the web, interactive, in a PowerPoint presentation. It's important to know where. And what I'm going to do in this quick lesson is just take you through two examples, one of a print document and then one of a web document, and just some of the settings that you might need to be aware of as you work through these projects. So first of all, I am clicking on the Launch Bridge button, or you can choose File, Browse, and Bridge. And I am in my Chapter 03 folder in the project files for PSCS4 Advanced. I'm double clicking on Guitar 1 and clicking OK. Now I'm going to say that I'm working in print first of all, and I do want to get rid of Adobe Bridge in the background. So in order to hide it, I can just press the F key once, and that changes my screen mode to turn the background into a neutral gray, block out my other applications, and even my desktop pattern. I'm now going to check one of the most critical things, and that is the image resolution and size. I am going to use this in print, so I go to Image, Image Size, and I look at this and it says resolution is 180. But the height and width are relatively large, much larger than I need them to be. So one really great thing that you should know, especially if you do a lot of work with digital cameras, is that if you have a large image, you can steal that information away and add it to your resolution without degrading your image. The rule of thumb, just so you understand about how much resolution you should have, is that it should typically be 1.5 times the LPI. What's LPI? Look real close at any printed document and you'll see little dots creating your image. Nothing is created with a tint. When you go to print something, your images are created with little dots. The amount of dots per inch is what creates the LPI. Look at a newspaper image, you can probably see those dots. Look in a brochure, you probably can't. The magic number is about 133 LPI before you don't see the dots. If you're sending your image out to a professional printer, they're probably printing at 133 or higher, and that's where you get that magic number of 300. But if you're just sending this to your printer, you probably can't get above an 80 LPI or 90 LPI, so you could probably get away with a 200 resolution image at the most. So again, rule of thumb, 1.5 to 2 times the LPI. So if you're dealing with a professional printer, you can ask them, hey, what's the LPI you're going to print this at? And if he says 133, you can easily choose 266 in here and be fine. I'm going to play it safe and change this to 300. But before I do that, I'm going to uncheck Resample Image, type in 300, and notice that as I do this, the width and height are being adjusted appropriately, pulling that information down. So in other words, if I'm giving a really small image, maybe a 4 by 4 inch image, and somebody wants to have that at a higher resolution, you might come down to about a 1.5 by 1.5 inch image that probably wouldn't look all that great. So keep that in mind. I'm taking a larger image and increasing the resolution by kind of taking it from the width and height and adding it to the DPI. Now I'm clicking OK, and you don't see the size of the image change at all. I just want you to notice something. I'm going to press Z to go to the zoom tool. And now that I'm working in here, you'll also see that at the top in the control panel, there's a print size button. And I'm going to click that on because I am going to print this and I want a better, more realistic idea of how large this image is going to appear. Next thing, I want to see rulers and I want them to be in inches. Command R is rulers. Control R if you're on the PC. Right-click on the ruler to change the measurement. In this case, I do want to keep that at inches. If you have a Mac and you don't have a right-clicking mouse, Control-click right on the ruler and this drop-down menu appears. Leave it at inches. Next thing I'm going to do is check my settings. Edit, Color Settings, In this particular case, I am going to press, so I am choosing North American Pre-Press. And I'm also going to change just one other thing where it says RGB, Preserve Embedded Profiles. I am going to convert to working RGB, which is Adobe RGB. And Adobe RGB is one of the widest gamuts that you can have. It will encompass things such as large format printers as well as regular presses. So we're just going to stick with that right now. And as far as profile mismatches, I'm just going to say, you know what? I really don't want to be bothered with this right now. We'll discuss color in a lot more detail later in the lessons. Click OK. And now that I'm ready to go, notice that I'm going to still stay in RGB. I'm going to go up to Arrange Documents, and I'm going to choose to float all windows so you can see the top of this window, and it states I'm in RGB. But I'm also going to press Command Y. And if you remember in the earlier lessons, I discussed that when you press Command or Control Y, it will put your image into a preview mode to show you what this image will look like as best as it can in CMYK based upon your color settings. So we just work in that mode so that we can work accurately with our color as accurately as we can without any other color management in place. Now moving on, I'm going to go ahead and put 3 different images in here using 3 different methods. I'm choosing, first of all, File, Place. I'm going to navigate out to my desktop folder. Into the project files, into the Chapter 3 folder, and I'm going to place Guitar 2. Now, right now Photoshop is asking me, how big do you want this image in here? I'm just taking up the whole document right now because it happens to be that this image is as large exactly as the image that it is being placed into. I'm going to press the Enter key or Return key to say this is fine at this size. I'm going to bring up the Layers panel to show you something. There's an icon down in the lower right of that guitar layer, and that is stating that this image is a smart image. Now, why am I bringing this up right now when I'm going to cover this in more detail later? Because it all has to do with the resolution. I'm not maybe quite sure how large I'm going to use this image, but if I bring it in as a smart image, I can press Command or Control T to transform this. I can go ahead and open up this window a little bit more so I can see the handles. Grab my Shift key and resize this image. Now, in fact, I'm going to resize it really, really small. Now, what would happen if you took an image in Photoshop and you scaled it down really small in size and then decided that you needed to use it much larger? Well, typically you would lose a lot of resolution. But if I come in here and I press Command T again and I bring this up in size, you'll see that all the resolution is intact. And that is because this has been placed. And when you place an image in Photoshop, whether it be an Adobe Illustrator file or a PDF or another PSD image, it places itself as a smart object and the original image is embedded within this Photoshop file. Now you'll see that it is requesting that I press Enter or press the check mark up here in the control panel to say that is the size that I want to use this at. Now, another thing that's really helpful with working with smart objects is that when I press Command T again, notice that the width and height percentages are maintained. In other words, I know that this is exactly 45.8% of the original. Maybe somebody told me that I need to use this at 25% of the original. I can press 25, click on the chain, and now I know that I have this image at exactly 25% of the original size. I can press the Enter key and put the image where I want. So I'm now switching to the Move tool and placing it off to the side. Okay, I'm going to do a couple other things here. One is just to add a rule to this image and some text. So I'm going to take the Shape tool. I am clicking and dragging to put a rule around this image. Now you'll notice that as a default, a black shape appears. I need this to be a vector rule. And I also need it to be clear in the middle. Notice in my Layers panel that I have an opacity box and I also have a fill box. If I pull the fill down to nothing, you see nothing. pull the opacity down to nothing. Nothing. So what's the difference between these two? The difference is that if I apply a layer style, like a stroke for instance, and I choose that I want to put we'll choose a different color so you can see this. So I'll just sample a color off the guitar, click OK, increase the stroke a little bit. Now notice this, the difference between fill and opacity. Okay, I've put a stroke on this. I come up to opacity. Everything, including the layer style, goes away. Go to fill, the layer style stays intact. Now, notice that I can come back and double click on this stroke, and maybe I don't like this color. In fact, I'm taking this to print. Wouldn't it be a really good idea to make sure that I choose a color that's appropriate for the device that I'm going out to, the CMYK press? So I can click on this color picker again, and this time I might come up here and say View Gamut Warning. And what's going to occur is that all the colors that are out of gamut for the CMYK setting that I've selected in color settings are grayed out. Well, thank gosh I can't pick that hot magenta. But let's scroll down. How many people want that PowerPoint blue? Look, totally out of gamut. In fact, if somebody's insisting that they get a particular color, you notice on the right the exclamation point, that's essentially indicating that that's a really cool color, but it's never going to print. And if you click on that little color swatch, the closest available color that will work in your CMYK settings does appear and is relocated to. So maybe I'll just choose that I want that hot pink magenta, but it's not too hot. Click OK. I'll also change the position of my stroke to be centered so I can get a better corner, and then click OK. So what I've done here is I've created a vector shape in Photoshop. I've selected a color that will print based upon my color settings, and I'm going to do one more thing. I'll just add text real quickly. So I'm going to take the type tool, click out on my image, type rock in roll. It's really small. I'm pressing Command or Control A to select all. I can do one of two things. I can use a really favorite keyboard shortcut of mine, which is Command Shift greater than or lesser than, and that makes the text bigger or smaller. That would be Control Shift greater or lesser than on Windows. Now another thing you can do is hold down your Command key or Control key, and if you just point to the Set Font Size box, you can drag and of course visually change your size here as well. Now one thing that absolutely drives me bonkers is that when I'm selecting my text, I can't really see it. In fact, if I come in here and I choose another print safe color, so I'm clicking up in the control panel on the set text color, I still have that gamut warning on until I come in here and release it. Maybe I want to choose this bright red color. Now, when I click OK, it reverses itself, and it again is really difficult for me to see realistically what this is going to look like. By pressing Command or Control H, it hides the selection, yet that text is still active. So in other words, if I come back to this red and I choose white instead, I can click OK, and it is affected. I can come up here and choose a font as well. So notice I just click and drag across the font name, and by pressing the arrow key up or down, I can kind of cycle through all the fonts that are available that I want to use. We'll select this one. I also want to apply an effect. I have to tell Photoshop I'm good with that text. Check mark. Go to Effect and do a drop shadow because there just aren't enough drop shadows around today. Using the drop shadow layer style, I can click and drag right out of my image to set where I want that drop shadow and click OK. So now I want to use this image in an InDesign document, for instance. What I can do is take my crop tool. I'm pressing C. I'm not quite sure how much I'm going to need once I get into InDesign. But one thing I do know is that I want the entire image available to me. I'm opening up my layers panel. At the very bottom, I have a locked layer called background. You don't really need a background. I'm holding down my Option key. If you're on the PC, you'll hold down your Alt key. And while you're holding down your Option or Alt key, you double click on background and it turns this into a layer. You shouldn't really leave this named layer 0, but for what we're going to do right now, this is fine. I just want to change this into a layer instead of a background. I'm still on my crop tool. I click and drag and I choose what I think I'm going to use. Now notice at the top on the control panel that I can delete my cropped area or I can hide it. And this will only work if you're using layers. And when I choose hide and I hit the enter key, boom, I've got my image cropped. But notice that if I take my move tool and I move this image around, that it actually hasn't been cropped at all. The entire image has remained intact. So that's how you can work with a print document, just some tips and tricks to help you through. I'll be going into a web document in the next lesson.